Hello and welcome to Bloomberg Quint. You're watching the Fineprint. So far, foreign portfolio investors or FPIs coming to India were having to deal with over 50 circulars, 183 FAQs and surviving framework of the foreign institutional investment regime. This week, market regulator SEBI has simplified the investing regime for FPIs. The new regulations make way for a liberal FPI categorization, expansion of the list of instruments that FPIs can invest in, and a controversial ODI regime, among other things. To talk about the key changes in SEBI's FPI framework, I'm joined by Richi Sancheti of Nishith Desai Associates and Divaspati Singh from Khaitan. Welcome to the Fineprint. Richi, before I come to the specifics, what is the broad message to your mind that SEBI is sending through its new regulations? Is there a philosophical shift that you see in how FPIs are viewed as an investor category?
So I think personally it's been a very poignant moment when these FPI regulations are being introduced. On one hand, the messaging from the government is very clear that we are aiming to be a $5 trillion economy by 2025, and accordingly all the agencies of the government, whether it is RBI, SEBI, Ministry of Finance and so on and so forth, they're all pulling together in the same direction, and the FPI regulation seems to be a fine piece from SEBI to that extent, where a lot of the previous rules, circulars, etc. seem to be sort of incorporated within the main law itself. And let's start afresh on a fresh foot. So I think it's a very pragmatic move from SEBI, and a lot of feedback from the industry that it has been receiving over the years now seem to have been taken into account. So we are happy with the draft of the regulations which finally got passed by SEBI.
All right, so let's get down to details. The first big change has to do with how FPIs are categorized, and SEBI had alluded to this, of course, after its board meet last month. So far, FPIs were bucketed under three categories. Category 1 included government entities, Category 2 included regulated broad-based funds, and endowments, charitable societies, foundations, family offices fell under Category 3. Now, the new regulations have collapsed these categories into two. Category 1 will now include governments and government-related investors such as central banks, sovereign wealth funds, pension and university funds, regulated entities such as insurance, banks, and entities from the Financial Action Task Force or FATF member countries, which are appropriately regulated, will also fall under this category. And then there is Category 2, which is everyone else. That will include funds that don't fall under Category 1 but are regulated, endowments and foundations, charitable organizations, corporate bodies, individuals, appropriately regulated entities investing on behalf of their client, unregulated funds in the form of limited liability partnership and trusts, etc. Divaspati, that's a long list, but that I've read out. What does this shift in categorization indicate and mean for foreign portfolio investors?
Yep. I think what SEBI's tried to do is also, as Richie also mentioned, that they've tried to simplify the entire regime. Earlier there were three categories. Now they've bucketed most investors into broadly two categories. If I could put it like the safer set of investors, which are more regulated, sovereigns, pensions, institutional investors, that is Category 1. And the unregulated investors or investors coming from non-FATF, they've all bucketed them in a separate category. And then from a KYC perspective and monitoring perspective, it becomes easy for the regulator. So all the safe set of investors have similar guidelines in terms of KYC, etc. And the residual category is just one single category which buckets all the, if I could put it like, unsafe or more unregulated investors.
Or something that SEBI would like to closely monitor.
Absolutely.
Okay. Richie, SEBI has also said that any entity whose investment manager is from a FATF jurisdiction or is at least 75% owned or controlled by any of the other categories, entities that come under Category 1 will also fall under the Category 1 bucket. Is it a welcome move for funds based, let's say, in Mauritius, etc.? And how is this a departure from the regulatory framework that so far existed?
Right. See, I think this is definitely something which a lot of asset managers spread across globally would look at very carefully, and the fine print which is going to sort of follow quickly on what does being bucketed as Category 1 FPI mean, what does a Category 2 FPI mean. Today, if one looks at only the regulations that have been released, the difference seems to be on who can issue and subscribe to ODIs. Now that obviously is definitely a sensitive area, which has been sort of chronicled over years now. But I think there could be several other areas like KYC, being treated as an institutional investor from a tax perspective and so on and so forth, where there is a distinction which could perhaps follow, being bucketed as category 2 versus category 1. Which is where, I think looking at Mauritius-based structures, Mauritius itself not being a direct member of FATF, but part of the associate member. Same is the case with Cayman, where it is not directly a member of FATF. It could definitely impact a lot of structures coming out of Cayman or Mauritius, which have not traditionally directly been acting as master to US-based feeders and so on and so forth. They have traditionally also acted as direct pooling vehicles where investors from multiple different jurisdictions have been sort of coming together. So I think there definitely is some sort of suboptimal solution that could be coming out for them if they were to be clubbed as category 2, and category 2 perhaps if it's not treated as an institutional investor sort of a class. So we could definitely see some impact for them.
Devaspathi, you'd like to add to that?
No, absolutely. I think what Richie is saying is bang on the point. I broadly see three major issues. One is, of course, on the ODI issuance, erstwhile Mauritius or current Mauritius Cayman structures, which are considered regulated, have the eligibility to issue and subscribe to ODIs. That may go away. Second is the entire qualified institutional placement framework, where a lot of Mauritius funds, Cayman funds, which were earlier tagged as category 2, now if they come under the new category 2 and which are not regarded as QIPs, they may have some fallout in terms of whether they're eligible to participate in the qualified institutional placement framework. That was the second issue. Third, larger issue also is from the tax front. The current Cat 1 and Cat 2 had an exemption from indirect transfer tax provisions. The Vodafone tax, as we call it, which was introduced to take care of certain inefficiencies. Now, in the new categorization, whether that will apply to both Cat 1 and Cat 2 or only to Cat 1 is something which we'll need to see.
Sure, I'll come to that, but specifically given that they have said that if you are your investment manager is from a FATF compliant jurisdiction, or that you are 75% owned and controlled by any of the other Cat 1 entities, then you will fall under category 1.
Yep.
How is this, let's say, a change in approach from what existed currently? And also, does it give some breather to entities who were, let's say, now in category 2 or 3, will now be seen as a more safer FPI investors? So,
we will need to understand how typically fund structures are set up. Now, on one side, you have the entire regulatory framework, and on the other side, whether you're taking treaty benefits or not, you also have the entire tax framework. Sure. So, from a fund perspective, it's always imperative that the manager is also sometimes set up in the jurisdiction where the fund is there. So, if you're looking at setting up a structure in Mauritius, most likely you'll also have the manager based out of Mauritius. So that takes away one flexibility from a Cat 1, that your manager is again based on a non-FATF. So far as investor base is concerned, you could have institutional investor base, which is universities, pensions, banks, financial institutions, etc. Or you may also have family offices, you may also have HNIs, you may also have non-institutional investors. Now what the regulations provide for is if more than 75% of your investor base is a Cat 1 compliant, then you may be treated as a category 1. But there, I think the point to note is the regulations also say that such investors will essentially have to give an undertaking that they are responsible and liable for the activities. Now, in a fund structure, classical fund structure, these investors are passive investors, right? They have no say in terms of the fund management. So to get such sort of undertakings from the investors is, I would say, it will be very difficult or next to impossible.
Okay, all right. Richie, we did talk about this when the SEBI board meet announcements had, come out, and that has to do with the regulator now doing away with the broad-based criteria, and that was a requirement for category 2. How does that sort of fit into a liberal approach now the regulator is taking, and that's going to be definitely a friendly move towards funds who found it difficult to meet some of the onerous conditions of fulfilling the broad-based criteria, right?
Right. See, I think personally there are different views to be taken on whether it is actually going to be helpful and does it resolve, or does it again look at something suboptimal. And I'll give you the reason why. See, to begin with, if a fund was meeting the broad-based criteria, it was obviously being seen as being eligible for a category 2 FPI categorization, and obviously that did come with some of the benefits like Devas also summarized, including being perceived as an institutional investor. Now today, with the new regulations, with the broad-based criteria being done away with, you now see a same homogenized treatment being meted out to both broad-based vehicles as well as unregulated vehicles altogether. This, in a way, could be suboptimal for, let's say, broad-based funds, which could be in Mauritius or in Cayman. So even though they have actually pooled several large number of investors, they may be meeting the previous broad-based criteria, yet they are being lugged together along with family offices and corporates, which is where if they were treated any less favorably from the previous regime, they may feel that they have had a little rough end of the stick.
Okay, all right. The second important change that I'd like to talk about is FPI constituents, and that has to do with the eligibility of an FPI. There are several conditions listed there, but one of them is curious. They've said that an NRI or an overseas citizen of India, that is an OCI, cannot be constituents of an FPI. They can contribute to an FPI only if they meet the conditions that SEBI will eventually prescribe. So far, NRI and OCI contributions to an FPI were capped at 25% at an individual level and 49% at an aggregate level. Devaspathi, does this blanket statement that NRIs and OCIs cannot be part or constituents of FPI scare you, or are you taking solace in the fact that the regulator has said that, look, we're going to prescribe the conditions and the existing regime of, let's say, the 25 and 49% could perhaps continue?
Yeah. So, okay, it doesn't scare me because it's coming somewhere from the last year's circulars and the discussion points which SEBI had. NRIs were in any case limited from registering as FPIs, so that is not a new introduction. OCI definitely is a new introduction because those are people with foreign passports but who have an OCI card. So that is a new introduction, but that again is in line with the limitations which came out on NRIs, OCIs as of last year. The way I am at least reading it is basically if you see the latter part of the regulations, the repeal and savings clause, that says that the current circulars or the erstwhile circulars which were issued under the 2014 regime, they continue as if they were issued under the current regime.
Oh God, so there's no getting away from those 50 circulars?
That's how I'm reading it.
Okay. Yeah. Richie, is that your opinion too, that the 25 and 49% caps will continue since the circulars are operational and operative for all practical purposes?
See, I would like to think of it slightly differently, and the reason I believe so is that clearly there has been a layer of and pile-up of circulars that have been coming up on the same topic, same themes, like a 2016 circular being superseded by a 2018 and again being superseded by a 2019. I think the basic starting point for the regulator was that how can we sort of bring everything back to the same table, let the reading of the law be an easier exercise. So I think a different way to look at it could be that the 2019 regulations is a fresh start, and SEBI obviously is going to sort of look at each of the circulars that have been issued under the previous regulations and come out with a more robust compendium of sort of FAQs which could address or which could lay out their views on each of the topics.
All right, and at least even a clarity on which of those more than 50 will continue rather than, giving a blanket statement that all of them are operational is hardly going to help, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. Richie, the third important change that I'd like to now talk about has to do with the investment restrictions for FPIs. The pool of instruments that FPIs can invest in has been expanded to include REITs, InvITs, and units of Category 3 Alternative Investment Funds or AIFs. How are you looking at this expansion of instruments, and does this open up any welcome possibilities?
Absolutely. So I think as far as the FPI program is concerned, the foreign investors by and large are relying on the domestic custodian in the format of a DDP arrangement. And the government obviously is trying to encourage as many asset classes that can absorb portfolio inflows into the country. because these investors are obviously a very natural catchment. They're already accessing quoted equity shares and so on and so forth. So let's open up the entire bouquet of opportunities. And whenever there is any sensitivity, there are limitations already prescribed, like cash equities has a cap of 9.99% for portfolio investors. I think the more interesting piece was what SEBI has reserved for RBI. This is on the debt side. I'm sure a lot of the industry would be looking very closely at the different committee reports that RBI has been issuing, where they are not only mulling over allowing the FPIs to invest in NPAs directly, but they're also considering that can they directly do a secondary purchase of a portfolio of loans from banks, whether they are NPAs or let's say even standard loan pools. So definitely FPI regime is going to see a lot more action. A lot of asset classes are expecting cash flows to come from the FPI regime. So I think this opening up is absolutely in line with the broader picture.
All right, the fourth important change I want to talk about is the ability of FPIs to issue overseas derivative instruments or ODIs. For the benefit of our viewers, ODIs are issued by FPIs overseas against securities held by them that are listed or proposed to be listed as its underlying. Richie, given that the categories have now been rejigged, how does this impact the ability of certain FPIs to issue these instruments?
Right. So I think let me clarify a couple of points. Under the old regulations, both Category 1 as well as Category 2, FPIs could have issued or subscribed to ODIs, barring those funds which were relying on the manager to sort of satisfy the appropriately regulated criteria. Now, if the universe is now going to be limited to only Category 1 FPIs, then some of the Mauritius-based funds and Cayman-based structures that we spoke about, which are, let's say, not owned 75% by FATF member jurisdiction sort of feeder vehicles, or they are themselves not directly managed by asset managers who are out of FATF member countries, they suddenly will see themselves to be ruled out from the subscription and issuance side of the ODIs, which is where I think the original point we were trying to make was that it may impact some of the existing operators in a negative way. Because a lot of ODI subscriptions have been through the Cayman-based fund structures. Issuances have largely been through Mauritius, Singapore, or France-based FPIs who hold the underlying hedge but issue the ODIs to Cayman-based structures or Mauritius-based structures. Now suddenly they will have a sunset on the existing ODIs, and for any fresh rollover they'll have to look at the new regulations where they'll suddenly see that they are no longer eligible. So I think there is definitely some shift on the eligibility criteria, which is going to impact quite a few Cayman and Mauritius-based structures out of the new regulations. Okay.
Divaspati, Richie has mentioned a category that was earlier able to issue ODIs, which may not be able to do so now. Any additions that you see there of entities who probably have been now facilitated to do such issuances?
No, absolutely. I think I'm entirely in agreement with what Richie is saying. So because all the Mauritius Cayman regulated fund structures which were absolutely kosher and in compliance to issue ODIs, now suddenly they would all be falling under Category 2 of the new set of guidelines, which are not eligible to issue or trade in ODIs. So we'll need to see in terms of, because one part is trading in ODIs, the second part is issuance of ODIs.
Correct. I'm just on issuance.
Issuance. So now issuance is being done by a lot of large prime brokers, the likes of whether it is Citibank, Morgan Stanley's, Merrill Lynch, etc. of the world. Now, on a look-through basis, would they be eligible on that 75% test which they've put, that if the key constituent of the FPI is from an FATF compliant country, whether the FPI would be tagged as a Category 1 FPI. So if they're eligible under that, then of course they may be tagged as a Cat 1 and then again eligible to issue ODIs. But if for whatever reason they don't meet with the eligibility criteria, they will all fall under Cat 2. And from an issuance perspective, it could seriously impact the businesses for a lot of these prime brokers who are currently established in Mauritius, Cayman and the likes, and undertaking their FPI business, undertaking their ODI business from there.
Okay. Do you see that, or do you read the changes to the ODI regs as at least an expansion of pool of entities who can at least now subscribe to ODIs? Because now they've said unregulated funds with investment managers from FATF compliant countries can subscribe to ODIs, and of course there is a fee that SEBI has prescribed there of $1,000 that the FBI will need to collect for every such issuance, right?
Yeah. So I'll see it both ways. So there's definitely a new set of category which is now entitled to subscribe to ODIs, which is your classical unregulated funds with regulated managers. There's also the current category, as we discussed, the eligible regulated category right now, which suddenly becomes ineligible to subscribe because they're not from an FATF compliant jurisdiction.
Okay. We've talked about FPI categories, we've talked about investment restrictions, we've talked about ODI issuances. The final point I'd like for the both of you to weigh in on is the clarity that's specifically required now that the regulations have seen, let's say, overall of sorts. Both of you alluded to some of the circulars that could be currently operative, but there are 50 plus of them. Richie, any immediate clarifications that SEBI needs to put out for the FPIs to basically either relook at their business models, their investments, their current positions, etc.?
See, I think an interesting circular that had come out, last year was around allowing private banks, stockbrokers on a global basis to set up structures and trade in India on behalf of their clients. A little conservative, but SEBI did insist and required that those structures be broad-based to begin with, and also they track a homogenized pool of assets for each such broad-based structure that they're setting up. This, I think the committee had also recommended, was a little harsh ask. I think now that the regulations have done away with the broad-based criteria, there is definitely possibility for every individual investor to track a unique portfolio for themselves. So the new regulations sort of only say as much that these regulated service providers, brokers and private banks can now operate these structures as FPIs. They have not indicated that there could be restrictions or there could be more rules coming this way. So again, going back to the earlier point that I was making, I hope that the previous circular are dropped, and accordingly these structures need not be broad-based or homogenized portfolio tracking mechanisms. I think that was one. The second piece, I think, which would definitely impact a few constituents, could be the underlying investments that an ODI can track. I think we focused earlier in this segment on who are eligible to subscribe and issue ODIs. But I think where there has been a lot of movement has also been what are the eligible underlying instruments on which an ODI can be sort of issued. Now, again, a couple of years back, SEBI had come out with a restriction that the underlying could be derivatives if it is only to hedge an open position, that too on a one-on-one basis, and so on and so forth. I think right now the regulations are silent. They only say that an ODI can be issued on any valid security that an FPI is sort of holding and hedging it. Remains to be seen that what circular will apply. Will the earlier circular apply, or would SEBI come out with a more unique set of underlying instruments that would be eligible? I think these two are other aspects which could impact a lot of businesses that revolve around the FPI regime.
Okay, Vaspati, you want to add to the list?
No, definitely. I think apart from these two, what also needs to be borne in mind is the list of other circulars and other regulators who have tagged between CAT 1 and 2 and 3 in the erstwhile regime. Now, under the new set of guidelines and new set of categorizations, how a lot of those regulations would pan out is something which we need to see.
And the biggest, I think, among them would be based on the categories that you mentioned, that whether the KYC requirements for those who have gone from CAT 3 to CAT 2 will come down, or for category who were always in category 2 but now have been clubbed with CAT 3, will the KYC requirements for those go up?
No, absolutely. I think that will be an easier fix because we're anyways hoping to see the new set of operating guidelines coming out in the next couple of days. So the entire KYC framework is going to be clarified there. So, but how the other set of rules and regulations are going to apply, maybe SEBI is going to come up with either a consolidated set of guidelines or new set of regulations on that, or even the Reserve Bank or for the tax department for that matter.
Sure.
So, how these new laws are going to apply in the new categorization is something which we wait to see.
Okay, all right. So it will be obviously optimistic to hope that these 28 pages of the new regulations are going to be the be-all, end-all for FPIs. Of course, circulars and clarifications will follow, but the hope is that the regime will not be as complex as it was earlier, because like Richie mentioned, the starting point was to simplify the regulatory framework for FPIs. But if you're going to have to deal with that many circulars, what's the point? Richie Devaswati, thank you very much for giving us your quick views on the new framework for FPIs. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next week.